Highways at night, isolated, silent, and shrouded in darkness, are more than just roads. They're pathways to the unknown. In this video, you'll hear 3 terrifying tales of highway horror that will chill you to the bone. From ghostly hitchhikers to endless loops and sinister phone calls, these stories will leave you questioning every late-night drive. Stay with us till the end, if you dare. These are 3 terrifying highway horror stories that will haunt you. The highway at night always felt different. It wasn't just the silence or the emptiness, but the way the darkness seemed alive, stretching endlessly beyond the glow of my truck's headlights. I'd driven this route 100 times before, but something about that night felt wrong from the start. The rain came out of nowhere. One second, the road was clear, and the next, a torrential downpour was hammering my windshield. My wipers struggled to keep up as water pooled on the asphalt, making the road slick and treacherous. The CB radio crackled with static. No friendly voices, no banter, just the white noise of isolation. It was supposed to be a routine haul, a straight shot from one depot to another. But then, through the haze of the storm, I saw him. He appeared out of the rain, standing on the shoulder of the highway. The high beams illuminated him, a lone figure, pale and gaunt, his thumb extended in a silent plea for help. I've always had a rule: no hitchhikers. It wasn't just about safety. I'd heard enough stories from other truckers to know that picking someone up on an empty highway was asking for trouble. But something about this man made me pause. His clothes clung to him, soaked through, and his face looked hollow, almost skeletal. There was a desperation in his posture, a heaviness that made it hard to ignore him. Against every instinct, I slowed the truck and rolled to a stop a few feet ahead of him. As he climbed into the cab, I noticed how cold he was. He didn't say a word at first, just sat there shivering, water pooling at his feet. "Rough night," I said, trying to break the tension. He turned to me, his eyes sunken but piercing. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first few miles, he didn't say much, just stared out the window as the rain pounded against the glass. I figured he was exhausted, maybe even a little shell-shocked. But then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. I glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, his hands trembling, and handed it to me. The paper was damp and smudged, but I could make out a series of numbers written in a shaky hand. Below them was a single sentence: "They're always watching." "What's this?" I asked, my unease growing. "They watch the roads," he said, his voice flat and distant. "They wait for people like you." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the chill that was creeping up my spine. "Who's they? You trying to spook me or something?" His head snapped toward me, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. "Don't stop. No matter what you see. No matter what you hear. Don't stop." I tried to brush off his warning, chalking it up to fatigue or some kind of paranoia. But as the miles ticked by, I started noticing things. First, it was the shadows. At the edge of my headlights, shapes seemed to flicker and move, darting just out of sight. I told myself it was the rain playing tricks on me, but the hitchhiker grew more agitated with every passing moment. "They're here," he whispered. Then came the whispers, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like the wind slipping through a crack in the cab. But they grew louder, more distinct, voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The hitchhiker began muttering to himself, rocking back and forth in his seat. "They're coming! They're coming!" I pulled my eyes away from the road for just a second to look at him, but when I turned back, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. No water, no sign he'd ever been there. My chest tightened as I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. I jumped out of the cab, rain soaking me instantly, and scanned the highway. There was nothing. No footprints, no figure in the distance. Just the endless stretch of road and the pounding rain. Shaken, I climbed back into the truck and locked the doors, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. And then I saw them. Figures lined the road ahead, dozens of them, standing perfectly still in the rain. Their faces were obscured, but their glowing eyes burned through the darkness, fixed on me. The engine sputtered and died. The cab lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. My breath hitched as the figures began to move, their steps slow and deliberate, closing the distance between us. Desperation took over. I turned the key, praying the truck would start. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The figures didn't flinch as I barreled toward them. They vanished just before I reached them, dissolving into the rain like smoke. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop, my heart pounding and my nerves shot. The lot was empty, the lights flickering ominously as I parked the truck and stumbled inside. The cashier gave me a strange look as I approached the counter, drenched and shaking. "Rough night?" he asked. "You could say that," I muttered, glancing around the store. My eyes landed on a bulletin board near the entrance, covered in faded flyers and missing person notices. My blood ran cold when I saw his face. The hitchhiker. The flyer was dated 5 years ago. I never drove that stretch of highway again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And when I look in my rearview mirror, I swear I see him, sitting there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. Some passengers aren't meant to be picked up. And some warnings come too late. The highway stretched before us like a black ribbon unraveling into the void. We were 3 friends on a late-night road trip, laughing and trading stories to stay awake. The car's headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing only the unbroken line of asphalt ahead. Miles of nothingness surrounded us. No other cars, no signs, not even a gas station. Just the road, the trees, and the endless night. Emily was behind the wheel, her knuckles tight on the steering wheel. Jake, ever the joker, was sprawled out in the back seat, his feet kicked up against the window. I was riding shotgun, keeping an eye on the GPS. The glowing screen showed a straight route with a single word: continue. "I swear we've been here before," Emily said, her voice strained. "You're imagining things," Jake replied, stifling a yawn. "It's just a boring road. They all look the same." But she was right. I'd noticed it too. A road sign, rusted and leaning at an awkward angle, had appeared at least 3 times in the last hour. The same sign, with the same unreadable text. My gut told me something was off, but I didn't want to admit it. Not yet. "Relax," I said, trying to sound confident. "We'll hit a town soon. GPS says we're good." Emily nodded, but her grip on the wheel tightened. Another mile passed, then another. The same sign loomed ahead, its rusted letters mocking us. "Okay, this is weird," Jake said, sitting up now. "How are we passing the same sign? We didn't even turn around." Emily's face was pale, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. "I told you, we're stuck, or something. I don't know." "Stuck how?" Jake asked, his voice rising. "I don't know, Jake," she snapped. "But this isn't normal." I tried the GPS again, but the screen remained unchanged. A straight line, no distance marker, no ETA. I refreshed it, then restarted my phone. Still nothing. "Let's try turning around," I suggested. Emily hesitated, but eventually nodded. She slowed the car, made a careful U-turn, and we started heading back the way we'd come. For a few minutes, it felt like progress. The rusted sign vanished, replaced by a stretch of road we didn't recognize. But then it was back. The same sign, the same stretch of road. Emily slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. "Number, this isn't possible." "It's just a coincidence," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's not a coincidence," Emily shouted, her hands shaking. We sat there in silence, the engine idling and the sound of crickets filling the air. Then Jake pointed out the window. Do you guys see that?" At first I thought he was joking, but then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, far ahead. A silhouette barely visible in the faint light of the high beams. "Is it a person?" Emily whispered. "Maybe it's someone who can help," Jake said, though he didn't sound eager to get out and ask. "Or maybe it's not," I muttered. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly, watching us. Or so it seemed. Emily honked the horn. The sound echoed into the night, but the figure didn't flinch. "I'm not driving toward that thing," she said. "Then go around it," Jake urged. With a deep breath, Emily slowly pressed the gas, steering the car toward the shoulder. As we edged closer, the figure came into sharper focus. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was wearing a suit, though it was torn and dirty, and his face was unnaturally pale. But as we passed, his head snapped toward us and we saw his eyes. They were black, not just dark, but void-like, as if they swallowed all the light around them. "Go, go, go!" Jake yelled, and Emily hit the gas. The figure disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the unease lingered. We didn't speak for several miles, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Then we saw the sign again. "Okay, this isn't happening," Jake said, his voice trembling. "We left that thing behind." Emily was shaking her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "We can't get out. We're trapped." The headlights flickered. For a moment, the darkness swallowed us, and when they came back on, the figure was standing in the road again. Closer this time. Emily screamed and swerved, the tires screeching as the car veered off the pavement. We crashed into a ditch, the impact jarring and sudden. The engine stalled, and the only sound was our panicked breathing. The figure was gone, but we all knew it wasn't over. "What do we do?" Jake whispered. Emily fumbled with the keys trying to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. The headlights flickered again, and then we saw them. Dozens of figures lined the road, their black eyes gleaming in the faint light. They were motionless, staring, waiting. "No," Emily said, her voice breaking. "This can't be real." I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen glitched, flashing erratically before going black. One by one, the figures began to move, stepping closer, their footsteps eerily synchronized. "Lock the doors!" Jake shouted, and we scrambled to obey. The figures surrounded the car, their pale faces pressed against the windows. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, the windows began to crack. The last thing I remember was the sound of shattering glass and the sensation of being pulled into the cold, endless night. We were never seen again, but sometimes travelers on that highway report seeing a rusted sign and a car abandoned in the ditch. Some claim to hear voices whispering from the trees, begging for help. Others say they see figures with black eyes watching from the shadows. And all of them agree on one thing. Once you're caught in the loop, you never escape. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a shortcut I'd taken before, a route that would save me at least 2 hours on my drive home. But this time, something felt off as I turned onto the old highway. The air was thick with fog, and the usual quiet of the road felt heavier, more suffocating, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I had been on this road before, many times in fact. It wasn't the busiest highway, but it was a familiar one, narrow, winding, with only a few houses scattered along the way. It was a shortcut from the interstate, a road that bypassed a town I didn't feel like passing through. And yet tonight, I felt an odd tension in the air, the kind you only get when something isn't right. The first sign that something was wrong was when I noticed the speedometer. I was driving at a steady 55 miles per hour, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness pressing in around me. Even though I could see a good distance ahead through the windshield, it felt like I hadn't made any progress. The trees on the side of the road blurred by, each one identical to the last, their twisted branches reaching into the fog like skeletal hands. I tried to shake off the creeping unease, telling myself it was just fatigue. But then the radio cut out. First, the static started, a low buzzing sound. Then, all at once, it went silent. I tried adjusting the dial, but there was nothing. No signal, just the eerie quiet of the road and the soft hum of the engine. I was about to reach for my phone when I saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, just ahead in the dense fog. It was a woman, dressed in a long, tattered white gown, her face hidden by the hood of her cloak. She didn't seem to notice me at first, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. My heart began to race, an instinctual panic setting in. I had always been told not to stop for strangers, especially on deserted roads like this. Something about the way the figure stood there, motionless and ghostly, made my stomach churn. But as I got closer, I couldn't bring myself to swerve. She was already too close to the edge of the road, and swerving could mean an accident. As I passed, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. I saw her for a brief second, standing still in the exact same spot, unmoving. Then, a split second later, the air felt thick, as though the fog had thickened even further. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I pressed the gas a little harder, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, something happened that made my heart drop into my stomach. I glanced back into the rearview mirror again, and she was in the middle of the road now. Closer, her head tilted as if she were watching me. She hadn't moved. She couldn't have. I hadn't heard her footsteps, no crunching of gravel. Yet, there she was, closer than before. I slammed my foot on the gas, my breath coming in short bursts, my pulse racing. I was sure my tires screeched as I pushed the car faster, but when I dared to glance again, there she was, in the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the road, watching me with those hidden eyes. I don't know how long I drove at that breakneck speed, the fog closing in around me like a suffocating blanket. Every time I dared to look in the mirror, she was there. Always further down the road, but always in my rear view. Closer with each glance, until the point where it felt like I wasn't driving alone anymore. I could feel her presence, her cold stare, even when I wasn't looking. Every turn of the wheel, every mile that ticked by, felt like a test, a question I couldn't answer. How long would this continue? When would she finally catch up? At some point the road began to change. It narrowed, winding tighter and tighter through the trees. The familiar route had become something else. Twisting, almost like the road was alive, trying to keep me there, trying to trap me. But there was no turning back now. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Suddenly, I saw a flash of lights ahead, the soft orange glow of a street lamp. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I skidded to a stop in front of an old gas station. The neon sign flickered above, a dim light casting a faint glow across the cracked asphalt. I didn't even think about it. I didn't stop to wonder why the gas station was even open at this hour, or why no one else was around. I just bolted from the car. I ran inside, gasping for breath, but the moment I stepped through the door, I froze. The entire station was empty. No one at the counter. No shelves of snacks, no drinks, nothing. Just the cold, sterile hum of the neon lights and the eerie silence. It was wrong. I could feel it. The bell above the door rang behind me, and I turned quickly, my heart skipping a beat. She was standing in the doorway, the woman in white, her face still obscured by her hood, but I could feel her eyes on me. Her presence in that small empty place suffocated the air. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my body frozen with fear. The silence between us stretched, an eternal moment where nothing moved. Then, without a sound, she reached up, pulling back her hood. And that's when I saw it. Her face, pale and twisted, cracked like old porcelain. Her eyes, nothing but deep, hollow voids, sucking in all light and warmth. I turned to run, but as I reached the door, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I never made it out of that station. And now, some nights, I'm the one standing in the fog, waiting for the next driver to pass.